this is Dodge. I'm back here, and this video I want to dedicate to to the subject, or to our awareness of what we are dealing with when it comes to um, this thing that we are feeling towards our therapists. Okay, and it's one of the chapters that I suggested in the link in the first video. The book is this. It has a very few it has a few interesting sections about what we're dealing with here. The name of the book is Creative Aggression. Great book about assertiveness. Okay, by Bach and Goldberg. Yeah, very well written. It's a good read. Great information about psychology. Okay, let's quickly get into things now. The first section that they talk about that I think is of interest, because there is one main section of their work here in this book. But for us to get into that, I think it was just interesting for us to get to know the previous sections, some of them, okay? So the first one that I like to show you or talk to you about is the section called The Therapist as Indirect Aggressor. Okay? So in this section they say that the therapist has to fulfill that expectation of being a loving figure and a very understanding figure. So the authors, they say that this relationship, the therapeutic relationship, can be contaminated by covert aggression. Okay? They say that the therapist is in total control of the relationship, and he is the one calling all the shots. This control that the therapist has in the relationship is expressed in a number of ways, a great number of ways. Nods, comments, gestures, expressions of interest. And through those things, the therapist can control and steer the interaction in any direction he or she wants or wishes. Okay. If the therapist denies this control that he has, Bach and Goldberg, which are the authors of the book, they say it's very destructive for a therapist to deny this great, they say immense power that the therapist has within the therapeutic relationship. Okay. So that's one very important thing for us to remember. The therapist has almost all the power in this relationship. So because the therapist has to fulfill this expectation of being a loving figure, and this relationship can then be marked by covert aggression, because of course he needs to appear loving and understanding, but his aggression will be there. But of course it will be a covert aggression. How does that covert aggression manifests? Yes, you can see. You might be able to see that. If he's withdrawn, he or she is withdrawn, if he's non-emotional, or if she or he has a guarded posture, like a poker face, you know that neutral face that they say is a face that hides. So this type of manifestation of covert aggression, what is the effect? The effect is your anxiety as a patient. because you cannot see any feedback, you cannot see any cues to what the therapist is thinking. So that causes you to try to read the analyst's mind, and even try to and even imagine the worst. So your mind becomes filled with ghosts, as my first therapist used to say. You start to imagining the worst things. He doesn't want to tell me, or he thinks I'm crazy and he doesn't want to tell me. Bach and Goldberg says it's a typical kind of imagination. When the patient faces um, a poker-faced therapist. Um, the authors then go on to say that this relationship is very loaded in a power sense. Again, the therapist as the one who is in total control. And the authors say, I'm going to quote them, the therapy relationship is a very loaded one in a power sense, with the power being almost exclusively in the therapist's hands. Page 103. If the patient then, unquote, if the patient then realizes and senses hostility, boredom, disinterest, or morbid curiosity, so then you see the power he is here. If you sense any hostility, boredom, disinterest, and morbid curiosity on your therapist's part, the therapist is so powerful that he can deny these things. If you confront him about this, he is so powerful that he can deny it. Okay? And he will lay it back on a patient. And they can usually say, you're projecting your own feelings. So see the power. Okay? It's not me, it's you. And the therapist can really say that because he's very powerful. It's nice for me to quote this one. The resistance of the therapist in sharing these aggressive feelings and responses openly is really more for the benefit and comfort of the therapist than the patient. Page 103. Even if the therapist denies all these things, you as the patient will see that in his facial expressions anyway, in his body language, his or her body language. The therapist's denial of these feelings, that I am quoting them again, will only serve to further hamper and abort the patient's attempt at achieving an emotional interpersonal reality. See, this interests us because what we want when we fall in love with our therapists is to achieve an emotional interpersonal reality. But if the therapist denies that he even has negative feelings towards us, the therapist is then blocking you at achieving this true emotional interpersonal reality between you two. Okay? So, for us, that means what? That means that the denial of the therapist that he has negative feelings towards us, like a real person in a real world, it's going to block any chance for me and you to have a real relationship with him or her. Okay? That was a very important idea to discuss, for us to be aware of. Okay, that section is over, and then they start another one. The therapist is not your social friend. This section was very hard for me to read. It took me, I guess, 5 years for me to have the courage. Of course, I bought the book years before. I had the courage to actually read this section. It was very hard to read, and it might even sting you, perhaps. The therapist is not your social friend. Okay, and then the authors say the therapist accepting manner is conditional. Okay, um, it only happens because you are paying a fee. Okay, it depends on the payment on the fee of the fee. But the authors observe that this is rarely verbalized in the therapeutic relationship to be what it really is. Many therapists, the authors say, try to create the illusion of a real, genuine, intimate relationship. But the authors say that if it was real friendship, there would be no need for money. So the reality of the relationship is he's not your friend, and it's not likely that he or she will ever be. Because what's happening here is just a commercial transaction. That's all that's happening. You don't pay your friend for his time. Friends don't pay each other for their time. But what happens here is a transaction. Uh, and it's dependent of the it depends on the payment of the fee and of on the therapist's schedule. Okay? And the most important thing in this section, one of the most important things I want to highlight to you is this reality should be recognized openly as such by the patient. So I want to tell you, be aware that this relationship is a commercial relationship. Be aware. It should be recognized by us, according to the authors. Okay. There is no deep friendship, and if your therapist led you to believe that that is an illusion, and when you come to your senses, you might end up feeling betrayed and bitter. Okay, at the end. Then they come back talking about the forms of hidden aggression that the therapist can show. One is called mystification, okay? When the therapist says you have deep-rooted problems, but they don't tell you what they are and how long it's going to take for you to recover from them. And this causes you to become anxious and dependent. So if you see that, if you leave this in your relationship, that is a form of covert aggression on the part of the therapist. Okay, another point that they discuss. The relationship is very loaded in a power sense, in another way still. If you do well, the therapist will take responsibility for it. They will take credit. But if you don't do well, if you are resistant to treatment, or if you fail, then it's your fault. Okay? And I must say, I felt something like that on the part, from that attitude. So it was like that. My therapist communicated like that to me. If you are in love with me, it is your doing. Uh, and if you keep feeding this feeling, okay, you are going to end up getting hurt. Okay, so I live this. So this point remind me of that. So the therapist might not um, feel responsible. Okay, he leaves you alone in a sense. But okay, let's. I wanna let this idea for later. Okay, and boredom. Coming back to the authors, boredom is also hidden as hostility. The next section that they write in their book is called Therapist as Victim. And in this section, they explain that because therapists are expected to be controlled, they decide that they will not um, openly confront their patients. Okay? Why? Because if they do, they fear that their patient's gonna run away, leave treatment, or they fear the risk of the patient attempting suicide to one make him feel guilty, him or her, or and then to tarnish his or her reputation. So because of these threats, many therapists avoid being open and direct. So you see, we are dealing here with one therapist as a very almost totally powerful um, individual in the relationship. Two, a therapist um, as not a friend but a provider of commercial service. Three, a therapist who will consciously decide not to openly and directly express his feelings, be them good or bad, okay, tender or aggressive, mainly aggressive here, for fear of being um, their reputation being slandered, okay, or for fear of losing a patient, of course, and here we're talking about money too. Of course, if it is a commercial transaction, therapists are worried about money. So they don't want to lose their money, their patients. And they also don't want to lose um, their reputation. But you see, here, what I want you to highlight to you is the nature of the therapist's work is such that it is safer for him or her to choose not to be open and direct with you. Okay, so here I don't want to tell you, okay, therapists are doing this because they are bad, or they are cold, or anything like that. Something like that. It is the nature, is the way I see it. It is the nature of their job. Some might decide, okay, I agree, perhaps they could be open and direct and not have that much fear. But not all of them will be able to do that. Okay? Let's remember that not all of them is prepared in the way that we as patients who are in love with our therapists wish they were prepared. Okay. Next section. And this is the section that's going to start to interest us more. The section is called Sex Between Therapist and Patient. Let me see if I am correct here. Yes. There are those who believe that it is therapeutic, the sex between the therapist and patient. But others see it as exploitative, and they come from unresolved problems of the therapist. Bach and Goldberg, they mention a research that was done. So, what is the profile of the seductive therapist? Yes, they know it. He is shy, he or she, shy, withdrawn, introspective, and passive. Okay, so here I stop and ask you, do you want to have a relationship with somebody like that? Think about it. The profile of women, because the authors say, that it's more common for women to fall in love with male therapists than for male therapists fall in love with female therapists. Okay, did I say that right? Okay, so they say the research, they discovered a profile of women who had affairs with their therapists. So these women, what they did, they blamed themselves for any mistreatment by men. And they were slow to express anger. Okay. So if you're a woman watching me right now, those are good points for you to think about. Okay, do some soul searching there. I also blamed myself for any mistreatment that I received by a woman, and that was when I had an abusive relationship with a person with personality disorder, the narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so I blamed myself for the mistreatment that I received from her for a long time. So that mindset comes from an abusive, when we receive abuse, psychological abuse. Okay, and when we are slow to express anger, perhaps we are not assertive enough. And of course, the anger can be expressed in a healthy way, and that is what assertiveness training teaches us. Okay. All right. Let's leave it at that. So Bach and Goldberg, they say again that the therapist-patient sexual relationship is marked by covert aggression. Let's see why. Because in general, it's a relationship of master and slave. So, and then they go on to explain. The therapist has total control, and the patient is the one that is totally dependent. The therapist is the one who decides when and where there will be any sexual encounters, how it will be performed, how often, and at what point it will be ended. If the encounter does not go well, is unsatisfactory, I can't pronounce that, the patient is the one that's vulnerable, and the patient is the most prone to self-blame. If it is a success, of course the therapist is going to take credit. Furthermore, there is no encouragement for you to assert your needs directly, and your demands are not paid attention to. So that's because you are the slave in a relationship. Okay. The patient will be too shy to make his feelings or her feelings known, because then he thinks, oh, okay, if I say this, if I say what I'm feeling, then he or she is going to analyze it later. So the patient becomes shy. He's not going to express. Okay. And they give an example. The patient is going to complain of the, okay, this relationship is too limited, I want more. And then the therapist will throw this protest back at the patient. Oh, this is just a manifestation of your problems, got nothing to do with me. See, the therapist is very powerful. The therapist can also be passive aggressive and might not even acknowledge or respond to your feelings. See, that's the power. Even if you, as the patient, express your feelings, they will be treated by the therapist as just material to be explored and not genuine. Okay? So the authors say, quote, it's truly a no-win situation for the patient, unquote, page 107. And they say, we as patients, we must put faith on our therapists. Otherwise, there will be no therapy. So the cards are all in the therapist's hands. Because of that, it's very easy to sleep with any patient. That's what the authors say. Okay, now I'd like to pause, and I want to remind you of this relationship of master and slave. I went to therapy after I had abusive psychological relationships with two narcissists. Okay, one when I was an adolescent, and another one when I was an adult. And when we see the Bach and Goldberg here talk about power and what happens, the covert aggression that happens when there is sex in a therapeutic relationship. If you come from abusive relationships yourself, you are going to see what I see here. I am repeating the same abusive relationship patterns of my past with my therapist. Okay? Everything that's here that says the therapist got a lot of power, the therapist can deny, the therapist can ignore your feelings, the therapist can take credit for everything that goes right and blame you for everything that goes wrong. The therapist makes all the decisions, and as we know, he who makes the decisions has the power. So this is the same thing that happens in abusive relationships. So that's what I want you to see this. So I see here that my attraction towards my therapist follows the same path of the past, of my past. So I am in a potentially another abusive relationship if I choose to feed my feelings towards my therapist. Okay, moving on. Bach and Goldberg says if sex happens motivated by a desire or by the explanation, oh, sex is therapeutic. So Bach and Goldberg see that as very exploitative. Okay. Because if that's the case, they say, okay, so the therapist, if he wants to be therapeutic, he must have sex with all his patients until the patient heals. And they say that's rarely what happens. What usually happens is the therapist who has sexual encounters will suddenly abandon the patient. What else? He will ghost the patient, abandon, leave the patient, will not give any explanations, and stop communicating. Abandon and stop any communication. And the patient will feel abandoned and rejected, and with his self-image very damaged. Moving on. Okay, let's talk now. We talked about the seductive therapist, but there are also seductive patients. Many women, and they say again women because that's what at the time of their book, that's what the research showed. Okay, more women falling in love with their therapists. So many women, they consider going to bed with a therapist a form of conquest, of personal triumph. They become special to the therapist's eyes and feelings, okay? And they feel that they have removed, when they have sex with a therapist, they remove the therapist from their godlike position. Many of these women have sent seductive signals, okay? They use so they use their sexuality as a form of aggression. It's their way to impact, to cause impact, to gain a foothold of power and of control in the relationship, okay? Because as we know now, the one that's most powerful is the therapist. If they don't seduce, they will continue to fear that they were still unable to assert themselves or make demands directly. So it's their way of getting control back. Seducing a therapist, okay? When that happens, the authors say it's very difficult for a therapist to resist a patient when that patient is seen for a prolonged period of time. Now here comes the paragraph that's most important for us. All this, now 30 minutes of video for us to arrive here. And I'm going to quote them, okay? The authors say, there are instances when sex between therapist and patient might be justified. However, we feel that this is always contingent upon the signals being openly stated and clear. That is, the therapist should take responsibility for acknowledging his sexual desires and for acting them out for his own sake, not the patient's. Alright. I don't think they say this very clearly, okay? It must come from the therapist being in love with you. And it must come from a genuine feeling of affection towards the patient. And the therapist needs to openly state that feeling and take responsibility for acknowledging his desire. So he is the one who needs to say, I'm in love with you. Okay? Not only you. Alright? He needs to say, my therapist told me once, he taught me, I once complained, why am I always the one who needs to go after women and tell them that I am interested in them? And my therapist, she told me this. She told me, well, are you not the one who's feeling in love? So if you're the one who's feeling in love, so you're the one who should take responsibility for showing your feelings. So that's what they're saying here. And this must be done, if the therapist ever does that. He says, I'm in love with you. The therapist must do that for himself, not because of you. Understand? Okay. Not understand, I guess it would be better for me to ask you, understood? Okay. The last section, and then I'm gonna give you my thoughts. A quick review and my thoughts, okay? Last section is how to choose and evaluate your therapist. I think that was important too. We as patients and as a society in general, we are hostile to people who are not nice. So, so the therapist is aware of that, okay? And because we tend to be hostile to people who are not nice, the authors say the therapists need to be real enough so that there can be aggressive as well as loving interchanges directly with him in the room. Okay. But there are the therapists who are always nice. Okay, so if that's the case, the therapist who is always nice is castrating your aggression, and that's no good, because when we have real relationships, we show, okay, I like this about you or about our relationship, but we also show I don't like this about you or about our relationship. Okay? So if the therapist is always nice, it's preventing you from doing that, and he will make you feel guilty if you ever show any aggression. And then he can accuse you of being disturbed or transferring that from someone else. And okay, he can say, okay, I'm so nice. How come you tell me you're feeling negative about me? So the authors say that to evaluate your therapist, you need to ask yourself a few questions, okay? Does your therapist say he's bored, irritated, or frustrated and invite you to do the same? That would be a great thing to happen, because that will be an indication of a genuine relationship there. Second, is he or she always loving? If yes, ask what he does with his or her aggression. Ask him or her if you're so perfect that he never gets bored, frustrated, and angry with you. 3. Does your therapist stay aloof, never revealing his own personal feelings, like kind of a god? Okay. You can ask him or her, why is he or she afraid to allow himself to be a real person in the room? To be a real person in the room. So if your therapist don't do that, don't reveal his frustrations or his irritation with you, that is a sign he's not being a real person in the room. Okay, and then they say, that's important, beware of the old-fashioned naive answer that you as the patient are there for an hour, which is to be spent exclusively discussing your feelings. Yes, I heard the same thing. Did you hear that? Okay, we are here for a limited amount of time. We have to talk about you. Whenever I try to get to know my therapist a little bit as a real person, she avoided me and she threw me that answer. Okay, so that is taken care of here for us. Okay. Um, so the authors say the following about this. The authors say there is another person in the room who is interacting and experiencing feelings. And then they tell us to ask, why is he or she afraid to reveal them? Why? Therapy is at its best a relationship between two people reaching for a mutual emotional reality. So when the therapist does not reveal his feelings, there's no way for us to reach a mutual emotional reality. Okay? Remember what we discussed earlier. Some therapists might be afraid to openly reveal those feelings that they have for fears that concern their own profession. Okay? So we might feel a little bit annoyed with our therapists because of their posture, but let's use empathy and put ourselves a bit on their shoes and remember that the therapist is providing a professional service. He's there to work. We got to remember that too. And he is a professional. He is trying to make his living like us. Okay, now 40 minutes of video, time for the summary of the main points I'd like to for us to fix this whole wordy video, all right? And I want to thank you for staying with me till now. Okay, first point for us to review. The therapist is the most powerful, okay? He suppresses aggression to fulfill the expectation of a loving figure that the whole society has. This denial of honesty about your attempt at achieving an emotional interpersonal reality. Okay, this denial of honesty abort your attempt at achieving an emotional interpersonal reality. Okay. So, okay, they need to fulfill these social expectations. So he will not be entirely honest with us, he or she. And because of that, we cannot expect to achieve an emotional interpersonal reality. Second main point I want to highlight and summarize. The loving figure of the therapist is conditional. It happens because of money. Friends don't pay for the friendship. So, the therapist is not your friend. The patient must recognize this, or the patient will set himself or herself up for feeling bitter and betrayed. Third point. The therapist is someone who needs to play the part of a controlled person. Again, the same thing as the first item, okay? He needs to be a loving figure and play the part of a controlled person. So if he openly confronts his patients, he expresses his genuine feelings, be them good, but mainly the bad ones, the patients could leave treatment or attempt suicide to make him feel guilty or tarnish his or her reputation. Because of this, the therapists avoid being open and direct with their patients. Okay? So again, that's another motivation for therapists to not be open with us. Fourth point that I wanna summarize. Some people might believe that sex between therapists and patients are therapeutic, but Bach and Goldberg say they view this as exploitative and the result of unresolved problems of the therapist. So now, here I'd like to ask you again, do you want to have a relationship with someone who has unresolved problems? I know I don't. That's not what that's not what made me fall in love with my therapist. The relationship is marked by covert aggression, master and slave type of situation. The therapist's decision and feelings matter, yours don't. Okay? So, this is exactly what happens in abusive relationships. Remember that, please. Fifth point. There are seductive therapists and there are seductive patients. Both come from unhealthy mindsets, unresolved problems, when we are talking about therapists, and the desire for power and the use of sex as a form of aggression on the part of the seductive therapists. Okay? So here I want to stop and talk to you. If you are living this, if you have this mindset, or if you are thinking about the seductive part, if you are thinking about using your seduction, the seduction techniques, and even the seduction that comes naturally, that there is a seduction, we are programmed with many techniques. They come very naturally from us. But if you are planning on using those weapons consciously, perhaps it can be good for you to ask yourself this: am I in a struggle for power? Am I really seducing my therapist because I want a relationship with him or her, or I am doing this because I need power and control? Am I a control freak? And if I do need this control, why? Where does that come from? I think this could be a very good form of soul searching there. And later you can use those questions in therapy. Okay. It can be, that's one of the reasons why I wrote in our discussions with in the comments with my friends here that have been writing, and they have been very generous with me writing, and in fact motivating me to keep doing these videos. That's the good part of these difficult situations, that we can have this awareness and then discuss them in therapy, so that a great good can come from it. Sixth and last point, okay? Sex in the relationship might be justified. That's the part that really, for me, it was the most interesting one. It depends on signals being openly stated and clear. The therapist should take responsibility for acknowledging his sexual desires and for acting them out for his own sake, not the patient's. So it must come from an internal desire on his or her part. Okay. Now I want to end this video with my opinion after all this. Okay, reading this book, and this book and these sections gave us a great background knowledge for us to know what we are dealing with here. And my opinion on this is the following, okay? Since, as we saw, uh, the therapists rarely have a motivation to be honest, to be open, to express his good feelings, but mostly his negative feelings towards us, which is what happens in real relationships. Because they are readily motivated to do that with you and with me, I think it's very unlikely, okay, that they will openly feel or declare true love for us. That's what I think. It is apparently it is in the nature of their job to not be totally honest. For fear of losing patients, for fear of being retaliated, for the need that society has, that to have that loving figure. The therapist needs to be a loving figure. What else we saw? Yes, I guess that's pretty much it. And let me see if I forgot. Because really, he really needs to fulfill that loving figure image. Precisely because of that, he also will not be totally honest and open with us. So that might happen, but I think it's going to be very rare. I wouldn't expect that from my therapist. Okay? I was watching once a guy named Billy Connolly, is a Scottish comedian, and he made a series of documentaries about some countries, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia. And there was once, I don't know if it was his travels to New Zealand or Australia, that he mentioned there was an artist who was in therapy, and in that relationship they ended up getting married. All right. So when I saw that really filled me with hope. And I did some research about that therapist, and yes, they married, and that was the only case that I ever found about a therapist marrying a patient. But then, when I did a research about that therapist, there was no mention on her, on anything written about her, that she was still a therapist or that she married her patient. So if that ever happens, well, uh, it can be very difficult for a therapist afterwards. The reasons, the whole community sees it with bad eyes. So that therapist would be kind of treated in a different way by all the psychiatric and psychology community. So that's another reason for therapists to never think about having feelings or admitting or acknowledging feelings for patients. Thank you for staying with me. I hope this was very informative. For me, it was. And it gave me a great and deep awareness of reality, of the reality of what I am really dealing with. When I get out of my clouds, when I leave the feelings aside, my fantasies aside, and read a book like that, that's what I found. Thank you, I hope it was helpful, and I see you in the next videos, okay? Where I'm going to keep talking about. There are many things I want to talk to you about, but this was necessary now because it's background knowledge for us. See you next time. Bye.